"Sir, step away from this terminal now." The command cut through the air sharp and public, loud enough to turn heads across Gate C like a ripple through still water, and in the center of it stood Malik Jefferson, unmoving, hands resting loosely in the pockets of his plain black jacket, eyes steady, unreadable, as if the moment unfolding around him was something he had already calculated long before anyone else noticed it was happening. And for a second the space held its breath, the rolling suitcases slowed, conversations faded into murmurs, and every gaze locked onto the same question forming in silence. Who does this man think he is, standing there like he belongs, when everything about him says otherwise to them? The sneakers, the lack of luggage, the quiet confidence that didn't ask for permission, and yet didn't explain itself either. And still Malik didn't move, not when the uniformed staff member took a step closer, not when another voice chimed in with a sharper tone. "This area is restricted, you can't just stand here." Not when a man in a tailored suit nearby smirked and shook his head like he'd seen this before, like he already knew how it ended, because to them this was routine, this was order, this was control, and Malik was the disruption they intended to remove, cleanly, quickly, without question. But Malik didn't give them that reaction, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't explain. He just looked around once, slowly, as if taking inventory of the moment, the people, the assumptions, and somewhere behind him a phone lifted, then another, the quiet glow of screens beginning to frame what was about to unfold, and the staff member reached out slightly, not aggressive but firm enough to signal authority. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time." And that's when Malik finally spoke, his voice low, even, controlled in a way that didn't match the tension building around him. "You might want to take a second before you do that." And it wasn't a threat, it wasn't loud, but it landed differently, like something deeper sat behind it, something no one in that terminal could quite place yet. And for a brief moment there was hesitation, the kind that only shows up when certainty starts to crack, but pride moved faster than doubt, and the guard squared his shoulders again, ready to push forward, ready to finish what he started, unaware that the moment had already shifted, unaware that Malik Jefferson hadn't stepped into the wrong place at all. He had stepped into the exact place he intended to be, and everything happening now was simply revealing who understood that and who didn't. The guard hesitated for half a second, just enough for the tension to stretch thinner, sharper, like a wire pulled too tight across the entire terminal. But then his jaw set again, and he took another step forward, authority returning to his posture as if doubt had never touched him. "This is not a suggestion," he said, louder now, making sure the surrounding crowd heard every word, making sure the moment stayed public, controlled, visible, and Malik Jefferson remained exactly where he was, his stillness beginning to feel intentional in a way that unsettled the rhythm of the space. Because most people in that position would have reacted by now, would have defended themselves, would have explained, but Malik did none of that. He simply stood there as if the clock he was following was not the same one ticking inside everyone else's chest, and around them the crowd thickened, travelers slowing their pace, some pretending not to stare while staring anyway, others openly watching, phones raised higher now, capturing not just a confrontation but a question they did not yet have the answer to. And somewhere to the left a woman in a navy blazer whispered to her colleague, "He should just leave," while a man near the charging station shook his head and muttered, "This is going to go bad." And the uniformed supervisor stepped in beside the first guard, her tone colder, more practiced. "Sir, we have procedures for situations like this, and right now you are not complying." And the word procedures landed heavier than it should have, like a shield used too often to avoid looking closer, and Malik's eyes shifted briefly toward her, not confrontational, not defensive, just observant, as if he were cataloging not just what she said, but how she chose to say it. And for a moment she faltered, just a fraction, before continuing, "If you do not step away, we will escalate this." And that word escalate moved through the crowd like a signal, drawing even more attention, and a young airport employee standing near the gate scanner leaned forward slightly, squinting at Malik as if trying to place something, a memory just out of reach. But before he could speak, the supervisor's voice cut across him, redirecting the moment back to control, back to authority, and Malik exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, the kind of breath someone takes not out of stress but out of patience, the kind that says the moment is not over yet, not even close. And then he reached into his jacket, not hurried, not cautious, just deliberate, and pulled out his phone, holding it at his side for a second before lifting it to his ear. The motion small, but somehow louder than everything that had come before it, because it shifted the balance without explaining how, and the guard frowned. "You cannot make calls here while we are addressing you." But Malik did not lower the phone, did not acknowledge the interruption. He simply waited, listening, as if the person on the other end mattered more than the voices in front of him. And when he finally spoke, his words were quiet, steady, precise. "I need runway access cleared," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the sentence to register. "Bring it forward." And to everyone listening, it sounded out of place, disconnected from the situation, almost absurd. And that was exactly what made it land so heavily, because nothing about Malik Jefferson had matched their expectations from the moment he arrived. And now the gap between what they assumed and what was unfolding began to widen in a way no one could easily close. And the supervisor exchanged a glance with the guard, confusion slipping through their practiced composure, while behind them the young employee's eyes widened slightly, recognition flickering but still unspoken, and the crowd leaned in closer, not physically but emotionally, pulled into a moment that no longer felt routine, no longer felt controlled, because somewhere beneath the surface something had shifted, something irreversible, and Malik ended the call without another word, slipping the phone back into his pocket, returning to that same still posture, as if nothing had changed at all, except now everything had. The words still hung in the air, "Bring it forward." And for a moment nothing happened, nothing visible at least, and that was exactly what made the silence heavier, because the people watching expected something immediate, something obvious, but Malik Jefferson returned to stillness as if the call had already done everything it needed to do. And the supervisor let out a short breath, her confidence snapping back into place like she had decided the moment had gone far enough. "That is not how this works," she said sharply, stepping closer, reclaiming the space with authority that had been slipping through her fingers. "You do not get to make demands here." And a few people in the crowd nodded, reassured by the familiarity of that tone, the certainty of it, the idea that order had been restored. And the guard shifted his stance again, preparing to move Malik out of the terminal. But then something changed, not in the people, not in the voices, but in the air itself, a faint vibration at first, so subtle it could have been ignored, but it was not, because it grew, slowly, steadily, like a distant thunder rolling across open land, and a few heads turned instinctively toward the massive glass windows lining the terminal, their reflections flickering as something approached from beyond. And the young employee near the gate took a step forward, eyes narrowing, trying to focus on what he was hearing before anyone else reacted. And the supervisor noticed the shift, her voice cutting in again, louder now. "Stay focused," she said, trying to pull attention back to the moment she could control, but it was already slipping, because the sound outside was no longer distant, it was present, undeniable, a deep mechanical roar that carried weight, power, intention. And the crowd moved almost as one, drawn toward the windows without being told, curiosity overriding instruction. And Malik did not turn immediately. He did not follow their gaze right away. He simply stood there as if he already knew exactly what was coming, as if he did not need to see it to understand it. And then slowly, almost deliberately, he lifted his eyes toward the glass. And that was when the shape appeared, cutting through the sky with precision, descending in a controlled arc that left no room for doubt. A private jet, sleek, unmistakable, lowering toward the runway directly in view of the terminal. And the reaction was instant. Not loud at first but sharp, a collective intake of breath, disbelief rippling through the crowd as phones shifted from recording a confrontation to capturing something entirely different, something no one had expected to be part of this moment. And the supervisor's voice faltered mid-command, her words losing structure as her attention broke away from Malik for the first time, because whatever she had been about to say no longer felt relevant, and the guard beside her took a step back without realizing it. His focus pulled outward, his certainty unraveling in real time, and the young employee's eyes widened fully now, recognition finally catching up to instinct. But still he said nothing, because The scene unfolding outside was speaking louder than anything he could add, and the jet's engines roared as it touched down, smooth, controlled, deliberate, the kind of landing that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway, and the entire terminal seemed to shift with it, the balance of power tilting in a way no policy, no procedure, no raised voice could correct, and only then did Malik Jefferson move, just slightly, just enough to turn back toward the people who had been so certain. Moments before, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, but now carrying something else beneath it, something that did not need explanation, and the silence that followed was no longer tense. It was uncertain, because the question had changed. It was no longer who he thought he was. It was who they had just mistaken him for. For a moment no one spoke, not because they chose silence, but because the moment took it from them. The roar of the jet still echoing through the glass like a statement no one inside the terminal could argue with. And Malik Jefferson stood at the center of it all without shifting his posture, without claiming the moment, without needing to, because it had already claimed him. And the supervisor who had been so certain just seconds ago now found herself searching for something to hold on to, her authority slipping in ways she could not immediately correct. That is not related to this situation, she said, but her voice lacked the edge it once had, the words landing softer, less convincing, and the guard beside her glanced between Malik and the aircraft outside, as if trying to connect two realities that no longer fit together the way they had before. And in the crowd the whispers changed tone, no longer dismissive, no longer certain, now threaded with curiosity, confusion, and something closer to realization. Is that his? Someone asked quietly, not expecting an answer but unable to stop the question from forming, and another voice followed. That does not just happen. And near the gate scanner the young employee finally stepped forward, unable to hold back what had been building in his mind since the moment he first looked at Malik. Wait, he said, not loudly but clearly enough to cut through the uncertainty. I think I know who he is. And the supervisor turned sharply, ready to shut it down, ready to regain control. But there was hesitation in her movement now, just enough to let the words exist in the space. And the young employee continued, his voice steadier this time. That is Malik Jefferson, he said, and the name moved through the crowd differently than anything else had. Not loud, not explosive, but heavy, like a key turning in a lock, unlocking a context that had been missing until now. And a man near the window lowered his phone slightly, recognition spreading across his face. The aviation investor? He asked, more to himself than anyone else, and the employee nodded once, eyes still fixed on Malik. He owns part of the private charter network that operates here. And that was the moment the shift became irreversible, because now the pieces connected. Now the jet outside was no longer random, no longer separate. It was part of him, an extension of his presence. And the supervisor's expression tightened, her mind recalculating in real time, trying to reconcile what she had assumed with what was now undeniable. And Malik did not rush to confirm it, did not interrupt, did not correct or emphasize. He simply let the realization move through the room on its own, because the truth carried more weight when people reached it themselves. And the guard took a small step back, not instructed, not commanded, just instinctive, as if his body understood before his mind fully did. And the crowd leaned in further, no longer watching a man being removed, but witnessing a mistake unfold. And the supervisor cleared her throat, attempting to recover structure. If there has been a misunderstanding, she began, but the sentence did not finish the way she intended, because the words themselves sounded different now, thinner, less grounded, and Malik finally shifted his gaze fully toward her, calm, steady, not hostile, not triumphant, just present. And in that look there was no need for explanation, no need for raised volume, only clarity, and the balance that had once been firmly in her control now rested somewhere else entirely, somewhere she could not reach. And outside the jet completed its rollout, slowing with precision, aligning exactly where it had been called. And inside the terminal the air felt different, not louder, not quieter, but changed. Because the question was no longer whether Malik belonged there, the question now was how quickly everything around him would adjust to the fact that he always had. The name lingered in the air, Malik Jefferson, and it did not explode through the terminal the way a shout would. It settled instead, heavy, undeniable, forcing everyone who heard it to recalibrate what they thought they were witnessing. And the supervisor's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders tightening as if the uniform she wore no longer carried the same weight it had just minutes before. If that is the case, she said carefully, choosing each word as if it might either save or sink her, then we can resolve this professionally. But even as she spoke, the foundation beneath her tone felt unstable, because professionalism had not been the starting point of this interaction, and Malik Jefferson heard it. Not just the words but the timing, the adjustment, the quiet pivot away from certainty into correction. And he did not interrupt. He did not respond immediately. He simply watched. And that was enough to stretch the moment further, to make it clear that this was no longer about procedure. It was about recognition. And around them the crowd leaned in closer without moving a step, their attention sharpening as the narrative shifted from confrontation to consequence. And the young employee who had spoken earlier remained still now, eyes fixed on Malik, as if realizing he had just unlocked something that could not be reversed. And a man near the window lowered his voice, but not enough to avoid being heard. They tried to remove him, he said, almost in disbelief, and another voice followed, without even checking. And those words began to stack, one after another, forming a quiet but growing pressure in the room. Because this was no longer a private interaction, it was a shared awareness, and Malik's gaze moved briefly across the faces around him, not searching, not seeking validation, just acknowledging the shift, and for a split second something else surfaced beneath his calm, not anger, not frustration, something older, something familiar. And the memory came without warning, not loud, not overwhelming, but precise, a younger version of himself standing in another terminal years ago, holding a boarding pass that had been questioned, not because of what it was, but because of who held it, the same tone, the same pause before assumption turned into action, and back then he had explained, had complied, had adjusted himself to fit into a space that did not immediately accept him. And now, years later, standing in a terminal he had helped fund, watching the same pattern repeat with different faces, the difference was not in what was happening, it was in what he no longer needed to do. And the supervisor took a small step forward again, her voice softer now, recalibrated. Sir, if there has been any misunderstanding, we can correct it immediately. And the word misunderstanding hung there, fragile, because everyone present knew it was not just that. It was assumption, it was pattern, it was something deeper than a simple error. And Malik finally spoke, his voice even, controlled, carrying no urgency. You asked me to leave, he said, not accusing, not dramatic, just stating what had happened, and the simplicity of it made it heavier, because it stripped away any attempt to reframe the moment. And the supervisor opened her mouth to respond, but the words did not come as easily now, and the guard beside her shifted his weight again, no longer sure where to stand, literally or figuratively. And outside the jet had come to a complete stop, its presence no longer approaching but established, grounded, real. And inside the terminal the balance had fully changed, because the authority that once pointed outward now faced inward, and Malik's eyes returned to the supervisor, calm, steady, leaving space for her to respond, not with force, not with policy, but with something else entirely, something that could not be issued or enforced, only acknowledged. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with everything that had just been revealed, everything that could no longer be ignored. And in that silence the truth settled into place. This was never about access to a terminal. It was about who was assumed to deserve it, and who had to prove it. And Malik Jefferson stood there no longer as a disruption, but as the measure of everything that had just been exposed. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a weight being redistributed across the entire terminal. And the supervisor straightened her posture again, not fully restored but attempting to rebuild what had already cracked. Mr. Jefferson, she said, this time using his name carefully, deliberately, as if acknowledging it might correct everything that came before. We want to ensure you have a smooth experience moving forward. And the phrasing sounded polished, practiced. But it carried a new layer now, one shaped by the realization that this was no longer a routine interaction, and Malik Jefferson listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but his presence now carried something unmistakable, not dominance, not intimidation, something quieter and far more precise. Control, the kind that did not need to announce itself because it had already been established. And the guard who had first approached him shifted back another step, creating space. Without being told, while the young employee remained still, watching closely, as if understanding that what was happening now mattered more than everything that had happened before, and the crowd, once fueled by curiosity, now leaned into something deeper, accountability, because the story they were witnessing was no longer about a man being asked to leave. It was about the consequences of asking the wrong man to leave for the wrong reasons. And Malik finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a slight shift of his stance, enough to signal that he was no longer being positioned. He was choosing where to stand, and when he spoke his voice carried the same calm weight it had from the beginning. "You did not check anything," he said, and the words landed without aggression, without emphasis, but with clarity that cut deeper than volume ever could, and the supervisor inhaled, preparing to respond. But he continued, not raising his voice, not rushing. "You saw me," he added, pausing just long enough for the meaning to settle, and decided that was enough. And this time the silence that followed was different. It was not confusion, it was recognition, because everyone in that terminal understood exactly what he meant, even if they would not have said it out loud before, and the supervisor's composure faltered for a brief second, the kind that does not show in words but in the space between them. And behind her the guard lowered his gaze slightly, no longer meeting Malik's eyes the way he had earlier, and outside the jet remained still, grounded, waiting, not as a spectacle anymore, but as confirmation, a presence that did not need to move to be understood. And Malik's eyes shifted briefly toward the glass, then back again, as if reminding everyone that what they had seen was not the point, it was the result. And the young employee finally spoke again, quieter this time but steady. "We should have verified before making assumptions," he said, not looking at Malik but at the supervisor. And that statement did something no command had managed to do earlier. It reframed the entire moment, not as an incident, but as a failure of judgment. And the supervisor nodded once, slowly, not out of agreement alone but out of necessity, because there was no other position left to take, and Malik watched it. All without pressing further, without demanding anything. Because the shift had already happened, the authority that once directed him now responded to him, and he did not need to claim it. It had been revealed, and after a moment he spoke again, quieter, almost reflective. "This is not the first time," he said, and the words carried something deeper than the situation in front of them, something that reached beyond the terminal, beyond the moment, into a pattern that did not need explanation. To be understood, and no one interrupted him, no one redirected, because for the first time since this began, they were not trying to control the narrative, they were listening to it. And Malik Jefferson stood there not as someone seeking resolution, but as someone who had already reached it long before anyone else realized there was a problem to solve. The words lingered, "This is not the first time," and they did not echo loudly but they settled deeply, like something familiar finally spoken out loud. And no one rushed to respond, because there was nothing simple enough to say that could meet the weight of it. And Malik Jefferson stood there with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning. But now it held something sharper, not anger, not frustration. Something closer to finality, and the supervisor lowered her gaze for a brief second before lifting it again, searching for footing that no longer existed in the way she expected. "Mr. Jefferson, we can make this right," she said, her voice measured, careful, but even she could hear how different it sounded now, not authoritative, not corrective, but reactive, and Malik's eyes remained steady on her, not dismissive, not forgiving, simply present. And when he spoke again it was not louder, not more forceful, but it carried more weight than anything said so far. "You are trying to fix the moment," he said slowly, but the moment already showed what it needed to show. And the sentence shifted something in the room, because it reframed everything. This was no longer about resolving an interaction, it was about confronting what had been revealed through it. And the crowd felt it, the subtle shift from tension to understanding, from curiosity to awareness. And a man near the window nodded slightly, almost to himself, as if recognizing something he had seen before, but never fully named. And the young employee stood a little straighter, not because he had been told to, but because the space now demanded a different kind of attention, and outside the jet remained still, its presence now quiet but undeniable, like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence no one could rewrite. And Malik took a small step forward, not toward the exit, not toward the staff, just forward enough to shift his position from where he had been held to, where he chose to stand, and the movement alone drew every eye back to him, because now he was not reacting, he was defining, and the supervisor instinctively stepped aside, not instructed, not commanded, just moving out of a space that was no longer hers to control, and Malik's voice followed, calm, precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "You told me I do not belong," he said, and there was no accusation in it, just clarity, just the truth of what had happened, in a terminal that operates under contracts I helped secure. And the words landed clean, undeniable, connecting the moment to something larger than anyone in that space had initially considered, and the guard's posture shifted again, this time fully, stepping back into a position that no longer projected authority but acknowledged it had been misplaced, and the supervisor inhaled slowly, the realization settling in fully now, not just who Malik Jefferson was, but what his presence meant in that exact space. And the crowd did not react with noise, not with applause or shock, but with something quieter and more powerful, understanding, because they had watched the entire sequence unfold. They had seen the assumption, the escalation, the certainty, and now the correction, and Malik did not look around for validation, did not acknowledge the audience that had formed around him, because this was never about them. It was about the standard that had just been exposed, and he held that space for one more second, just long enough for it to settle completely, before turning his gaze briefly toward the glass once more, toward the aircraft that had answered his call without hesitation, and then back again, as if to say without saying that none of this had been coincidence, none of it had been performance. It had simply been reality catching up to perception, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but it carried further than anything else in the room. "You did not mistake who I am," he said, pausing just enough for the meaning to settle. "You showed how you decide who matters." And that was the moment everything locked into place, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to reframe, only something to acknowledge, and the terminal, once filled with movement and noise, now held a different kind of stillness, one shaped not by control, but by truth. The silence did not shatter, it settled, deeper, heavier, like the entire terminal had been forced to sit with something it could not immediately move past, and Malik Jefferson did not rush to fill it, did not soften it, did not redirect it, because this moment was no longer his to control. It belonged to everyone who had just witnessed what had unfolded, and the supervisor stood there with her hands loosely at her sides, no longer issuing commands, no longer correcting behavior, just present, in a way she had not been before. And the guard who had first stepped forward now kept his distance, not out of instruction but out of understanding, and the crowd, once restless and reactive, had shifted into something quieter, more aware, because what they had seen was not dramatic in the way they expected, it was precise, it was revealing, and it left no room for denial. And then the movement came, not from Malik, not from the staff, but from outside, where a ground crew vehicle approached the jet with quiet efficiency, aligning with practiced precision, as if this arrival had been anticipated long before anyone inside the terminal realized what was happening. And a set of stairs extended from the aircraft, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, and the visual alone was enough to reinforce what words no longer needed to explain. And inside, a man near the window let out a low breath. "That is his," he said, not questioning anymore, just stating, and another person nodded beside him, eyes still fixed on the scene outside, and Malik finally turned fully toward the glass, not to admire it, not to display it, but to acknowledge it, as if confirming something that had already been decided, and then he took a step forward, this time with direction, not hesitation, not resistance, just movement, and the space in front of him opened immediately, not because anyone was told to move, but because no one thought to stand in his way anymore, and the supervisor stepped aside without a word, her earlier authority replaced by something quieter, something closer to accountability, and as Malik passed her, he did not stop, did not pause for acknowledgement, but he did speak, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough weight to remain with her after he moved on. Next time, he said, not turning back, start with the facts. And it was not a reprimand, not an order, but it landed with more clarity than anything she had said all day, and she nodded once, almost instinctively, even though he was no longer looking, and the guard lowered his gaze briefly, the moment settling into him in a way that would not easily fade, and the young employee stepped slightly forward, watching Malik walk toward the secured exit that now opened without question, without delay, as if the system itself had corrected its earlier hesitation, and the doors parted smoothly, quietly, and Malik stepped through them with the same composure he had carried from the beginning, unchanged by the shift around him. Because for him, nothing had changed, only everything else had caught up, and behind him the terminal remained still for a moment longer, the kind of stillness that follows not confusion, but realization. And then the noise returned slowly, conversations restarting, footsteps resuming, but the tone had changed, softer, more reflective, as if each person carried a piece of what they had just witnessed, and outside Malik moved toward the aircraft without urgency, without display, just purpose, and the crew at the base of the stairs stood ready, not performing, not reacting, simply doing what had already been set in motion. And as he reached the base, he paused for a fraction of a second, not to look back, not to confirm anything, but to allow the moment to fully close. And then he stepped forward, ascending without hesitation, leaving behind a terminal that had not just seen who he was, but had been forced to confront how it chose to see him in the first place. And in that quiet transition from glass to sky, from assumption to reality, the lesson did not need to be spoken again. It had already been understood. The door of the aircraft closed with a quiet finality that did not echo but settled, and inside the terminal the glass reflected nothing but a runway that had already proven its point. And Malik Jefferson took his seat without urgency, without ceremony, as if the moment that had just unfolded behind him required no celebration, no reaction, because it had never been about proving anything. It had been about revealing something that already existed, and as the engines began to hum again, low and controlled, the kind of sound that signals movement without chaos, Malik looked out through the oval window, not at the people, not at the building, but at the space between, the distance that had just been redefined in a matter of minutes. And back inside the terminal the supervisor remained near the gate, still, composed but changed, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet awareness that would not leave with the next shift or the next passenger, and the guard stood a few steps behind her. No longer positioned as a barrier, but as someone reconsidering what that position had meant, and the young employee leaned slightly against the counter, eyes still on the runway, not watching the jet as much as thinking about what had just happened, replaying it, understanding it differently now than he would have an hour ago, and the conversations that resumed around them carried a different tone, not loud, not reactive, but reflective, because the story they had just witnessed did not end with a confrontation. It ended with a correction, and corrections linger longer. They settle deeper, they change the way the next moment is approached, and outside the aircraft began to taxi, smooth, controlled, aligning with the path that had already been cleared, and inside Malik rested his hands calmly, his posture unchanged, because the power he carried was not something he turned on or off, it was something that existed whether recognized or not, and recognition, he knew, was never the goal. It was simply the result when truth met visibility, and the memory of the terminal did not replay for him as conflict. It replayed as confirmation. Confirmation that the systems people trust are only as fair as the people who operate them. And that fairness is not measured by policy, but by perception, by who is seen as belonging before a single word is spoken. And as the jet gained speed, the runway, stretching out beneath it, Malik allowed himself one final thought, not about what had happened, but about what would happen next. Because moments like this do not end when the plane leaves the ground. They carry forward, into decisions, into conversations, into the quiet adjustments people make when they realize they have been wrong. And the aircraft lifted, smooth and steady, leaving the terminal behind not as a place of conflict, but as a place that had been forced to confront itself. And as the city below began to shrink, Malik looked forward, not back, his voice calm in the quiet of the cabin as he spoke to no one and everyone at the same time. I did not raise my voice, he said softly, almost to the air itself. I raised the standard. And with that the moment closed, not with noise, not with applause, but with something far more lasting, clarity.